know this because you're here, but just in the spirit of it all, Dan is a senior fellow here at the school. And assuming that you have read his bio before you walked into the room and or you're personal friends of his, you will already know that he's held multiple positions in the Canadian government, including most relevantly to the book we're talking about today, the position of Director General of Security and Intelligence from 2002 to 2007. From the distance that retirement provides, Dan reflects in his book on the ways in which Canadian security agencies responded to 9/11. He considers the resources in the first half of the book that the Canadian government had at its disposal to respond to terrorism before this moment. If you haven't read the book, the answer is not many. And then how the government responded to the threat of Islamic fundamentalist extremism after that, not that well either. Soon as Dan is going to tell us why he wrote this book, but I get the job about speculating about that in advance, so here it is. There's three objectives, as I understood it, to the book. One reflective, one critical, and one constructive. So here they are. That's good? So the reflective objective. He's intending to reflect on a really difficult 20 years, an incredibly important policy space, right? He uses a panoptic understanding of security policy and how the government works before and after 9/11 to tell a full story, or a fuller story than we've read about before, about the changes made to security policy leading up to 9/11, those made after 9/11, where they were successful and where they were inadequate. He exposes just how much Canadian authorities deferred to an angry America bent on revenge. And he tells us that the Canadian authorities did not enough, in his view, critical analysis of its own, and one consequence of which is that Canada becomes implicated in some of the worst human rights abuses that are unambiguously violations of international law. But we become implicated in those abuses over the last 20 years, including arbitrary detention and torture. But another objective is a critical one. He's intending to consider many of the errors made by Canadian security personnel, errors that cost Canadian citizens, mainly of Muslim descent, dearly. And for me personally, this is the most moving part of the book. Right? Dan tells the story of many men, some familiar to Canadians, other less so, whose lives were devastated by their treatment at the hands of Canadian security authorities or Americans operating with Canadian implicit permission, many of whom are continuing to seek redress from Canadian authorities. And although we don't hear their own voices in the book, Dan treats them respectfully. And I think that there should be some real hope for these men, that their respectful treatment by Dan and the status that he brings to writing of this book can bring some of the recognition that these men crave and that they deserve in the public space. The book is named for them, right? The book is called Detained. And there are thousands of detained people in the war on terror. But Dan is moved to tell us about a particular man, and these are the men whose experiences gives the title of the book. And another objective is a constructive one, right? To offer those of us responsible in the present for protecting Canadians from the threats posed by Islamic fundamentalist extremism. By the way, he has a whole explanation for why he chose this term, and then tells us that all reasonable people will agree that this is the right term to describe the phenomenon he's describing. So you can ask him about it, but beware that you will be accused of unreasonableness if you disagree. But okay, so he wants to give people involved in the fight now some concrete strategies for going forward, strategies to avoid the errors of the past. He tells us that we must start with a parliamentary committee on security and intelligence. Have you been to question time in the UK? You know, every time they say committee, and everybody goes, woo, committee. Okay, so I had that in my head. But the committee nevertheless, will have broad remit to examine the mechanisms by which Canada's security and intelligence agencies can and should be held accountable for its past actions and into the future. So I think some readers will think that calling for a committee is weak tea. But actually, especially those of us who have spent the last several years compiling data that reports on the deep harms that counterterrorism measures have inflicted on Canadian Muslim communities, harm that is not yet fully repaired. But as Dan says, and I give them the benefit of the doubt, not only because we are office neighbors, we have to start somewhere, and we cannot ignore that accountability, quote, is the essential foundation for public trust in institutions with substantially intrusive and secret powers, end quote. And he also worries at the end of the book, towards the conclusion, because he sees that attempts to construct accountability machinery is being met, in his view, with unwarranted resistance, with, he says, quote, minimal or grudging support from security heads, end quote. It is more, and this is my objection to the book, he says it's more than a philosophical complaint, as though philosophical complaints were not substantial and weighty. And if he had thought about it, he would have known that asking a philosopher to chair this panel would highlight this deep objection to the book. Nevertheless, a strategy, so the objection is not philosophical, it's real. He means to oppose philosophical with real. He means theoretical. A strategy to combat extremism will fail without the cooperation of those who are most likely targeted by the strategy chosen, and this cooperation, Dan insists, I think rightly, is more likely in the context of a robust accountability regime. The communities who bear the burden of anti-extremism measures must trust that accountability mechanisms are in place so that they know that if they accept the burdens imposed on them in the name of security for all Canadians, that these burdens are justified and monitored and not in vain or wantonly imposed. It's a basic condition, people who know me will know that I would say something like this, of equality in democratic and diverse states, that any burden imposed on some but not others must be subject to a high level of scrutiny and accountability in the form of the robust accountability measures that Dan calls for. And now, Dan will take 20 minutes, and then he will happily take questions from you.
Okay.
Is that not true?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
That's great, Patty. Thank you very much. And I humbly accept that criticism of the book. And I think there will be a lot of other criticisms that are far more severe to come. I'm presenting a book that's only recently come out. It's about the American War on Terror, and most of us know what the War on Terror was about. It was declared by President Bush a week after the 9/11 attacks. And this book is basically about why it went wrong. And it's certainly my judgment that it did go wrong, and the why and where is the subject of my analysis. It's not a memoir. The cover of the book says it is, but it's not really. It attempts to be a dispassionate analysis, but I know that I have obvious biases, and I admit those right up front as a practitioner and as somebody who was involved in all 5 of the case studies that are examined in the book, in the second part. Now, I wish I could start by saying that I've come up with a stunning and brilliant public policy analysis of how to go through this ordeal in the future more successfully. But I can't. I have to admit failure on that point. Canada, like every other American ally, but even more so given our geographic location, we're perpetually impaled on dilemmas, and they're created by geography, by circumstance. There are no easy answers to the types of security and intelligence questions raised in this book, and it probably spills over into other aspects of our relationship with the United States. What I propose to do, let's see if I can do this, is roughly to go through this agenda in pretty quick fashion, and then open the floor to discussion, comments, wherever we want to take it. My apologies if for the next 20 minutes I'm a bit short on details and factoids, but I thought it was better to get right into the main themes rather than talk about detailed cases. We'll start with Afghanistan, because 9/11 had its roots in Afghanistan. Everybody here is probably familiar with the saga of Afghanistan, but I emphasize it in the book as the epicenter of a larger conflict that affected a good many states in the Muslim world. By the late 1990s, the word Afghanistan was the magnet that attracted the attention of every security and intelligence agency throughout the world. Mention the word Afghanistan, that was enough. I argue, however, that most of us in the West got the implications of Afghanistan wrong. Not immediately after 9/11, perhaps, but over the long run. Because through time, things have been repeated about Afghanistan which are fundamentally incorrect. To cite only a couple of things that seem to have been lost over time. The Islamic side of the Afghan conflict, which was then against the former Soviet Union, in the 1980s was supported by the United States. And it was supported as well by Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. That support for the Islamic side by the Western world seems to have drifted from sight over decades. The training camps of Afghanistan, for example, that's another small factoid. They were essentially run by Afghan warlords, not by terrorist organizations. Certainly not by Al-Qaeda, which didn't exist in any meaningful shape until about 1996. The Afghan conflict in the 1980s also created hundreds or perhaps thousands of what came to be called foreign fighters, or sometimes Muslim foreign fighters. And they were active in many conflicts in Bosnia and Chechnya, for example, in the 1990s. But most foreign fighters had almost nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, and most foreign fighters had nothing to do with terrorism. So again, that's a view that needs some elaboration. Let's see, where are we? I've already talked our way through this one, so we'll move on to slide 4. In the few years prior to 9/11, Islamic fundamentalist terrorism seemed to be on the decline globally. And I know in retrospect, people talk about 9/11 and the drama of 9/11. It seemed to be build-up or the culmination of Islamic extremism. But in fact, what was the reality on the ground? Afghanistan hosted a small number of defeated or semi-defeated terrorist groups with very restricted domestic bases. In fact, some of them had no domestic base to speak of. And they had a leadership group, certainly. They had some capability, as they certainly demonstrated on 9/11. But bin Laden's views were not widely accepted, even in his own councils. "9/11 changed everything, and it even changed the history of the Afghan conflict and a retrospective ability to assess Al-Qaeda's origins. A terrorist plot, which was not supported by many others among the Afghan extremist community, proved to be decisive in making terrorism the #1 foreign policy priority for the United States. Its more dramatic effect, and its more successful effect, if you want to phrase it this way, was that it drew the United States, as bin Laden had intended, into wars it could not win, into costly and intractable quagmires that challenged its economy. It also triggered the war on terror, which is exactly what bin Laden sought to achieve. Now, what was the war on terror really about? What really drove the war on terror was the need for more and better intelligence on the Al-Qaeda or terrorist threat, inside and outside the U.S. homeland. Before 9/11, the United States had almost zero capability of assessing its own domestic terrorist threat, but they didn't have much more of an ability to assess the foreign threat. The objective of the war on terror, certainly a substantial part of the war on terror, was to get the actionable intelligence, to use the phrase, to counter the Al-Qaeda threat and to get the perpetrators of 9/11. So within months after 9/11, the search for intelligence drove the United States in the war on terror into one key direction: massive detentions, followed by the interrogation of detainees thought to be close to Al-Qaeda. And the result was a series of decisions within the Bush administration on detention and interrogation that were eventually so controversial that they undermined the war on terror, the cohesiveness of the Allied effort, and they even overshadowed the eventual military efforts in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, what did they do? And I've got a series of items here which will be probably familiar to most of you. First of all, the United States authorized the creation of what were called eventually black sites, which were prisons run by the CIA in a number of locations for the eventual detention of about 100 to 120 what were called high-value assets, which were thought to be individuals close to the Al-Qaeda leadership. These locations have never been acknowledged officially, but unofficially they've been identified as Afghanistan, Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, Poland, Lithuania, Thailand, and possibly Morocco and Jordan. That was, black sites were one element. Second element was the expansion and elaboration of a new extraordinary rendition policy to put anyone, anywhere suspected of supporting Al-Qaeda off the streets and in detention. And throughout the book I use the word off the streets, which was actually the original title of this book until it hit the publisher's hands. And the publisher said, well, nobody's going to understand what off the streets means. We're going to call it Detained. But off the streets was the phrase they used to signify what they were going to do with the thousands of people that they thought either constituted a threat or had potential information that might be useful in the war on terror. Now, the Bush administration reversed decades of understandings on what the word rendition meant. They came up with new policies, and these were essentially the policies of greatest relevance to the Canadian case studies that follow in part 2 of the book. Because many Canadians ended up in foreign prisons either because of the rendition policy or because of the partnerships which were fostered through the rendition efforts on the part of the United States. Why was that? Well, detention abroad by way of rendition required the cooperation of foreign security and intelligence services. Somebody has to have the prisons to imprison the prisoners. Some were states that had long-standing relationships with the United States. Now, these are pretty easy to assess now. Jordan, Egypt, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. Some were states that were new to American cooperation, like Syria and Libya. The U.S. also decided to give a new mission to Guantanamo Bay, which officials of the Bush administration called a prison beyond the law, believing that it was essentially a prison in which people could be detained without legal recourse anywhere, to the United States or to international law. This was a destination of choice for a lot of high-value assets, and apparently is where all of the high-value assets are now currently detained. Thousands of people around the world were eventually detained, and U.S. allies knowingly or unknowingly, individually and gradually, were drawn into an alliance system framed by the United States. And I wanted to make one thing clear in the book, because it's not clear in the 2 reports of the Canadian public inquiries that were held, first on the Maharajah situation, the second one chaired by Frank Iacobucci on the situations of El Mati, El Malki, and Noord. And that's what I wanted to make clear, was that it was the United States in the war on terror, led essentially by the CIA, that had a central role in what happened to virtually all of the Canadian cases examined in the book. A second point that I wanted to make is that other allies like the United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, Sweden, have gone through exactly what Canada has gone through in dealing with the aftermath of the detention issues. They dealt with detainees as consular cases, Detainees came back to their home countries, lawsuits were launched, and very large legal settlements were effected in most of the cases. Very few of these cases have been reported extensively in the Canadian media over the years, but they're out there and they're easily located. Those early decisions also created intractable problems that persist to this day. And the main problem is, what do you do with detainees in Guantanamo Bay that can't, that can't be prosecuted because of the use of torture, but they can't be released because of the dangers they pose? What is the answer to that conundrum? And it's a conundrum created by the War on Terror in a decision to use extraordinary interrogation techniques amounting to torture. What happened to Canada and Canadians? And this is the substance of the book, of course. 2 public inquiries were held. Lots of lawsuits have ensued in the aftermath of the return to Canada of detainees. The 2 inquiries captured some important things about key cases, but I argue that both of them essentially missed the larger picture. I basically found that no U.S. ally was fully briefed on U.S. plans. Those plans were largely the work of political appointees within the Bush administration, working for Vice President Cheney or Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. President Bush, and this will come as no surprise to anybody, was remarkably unaware of what was going on. Secretary of State Colin Powell was deliberately marginalized from the outset, as was much of the State Department. Why was Canada engaged? Why were we part of this picture at all? And it wasn't simply because we were a member of the Five Eyes community or that we're a traditional intelligence ally of the United States. It was mainly because of our geographic location and to protect the Canadian-American border. The United States wanted assurances that it had no problems north of the United States. The Canadian interest was always in preventing the closure of the Canadian border, which would have caused our economic strangulation after 9/11. So where did it go wrong? This would be nice if we had a chart which said, well, here's the right way to go, and here's the wrong way to go. And I don't think anyone has mapped out what would have been the right way, except by implicit criticism. But there are some hints about what the right way to go might have been, and they come in the form of materials in the Chilcot Report. The Chilcot Report was a British inquiry about the Iraq War, which is tremendously long and detailed and took years to complete. But the Chilcot Report, which is a model of how to do a public inquiry, because if you read the Chilcot Report and you're online, you can click on a reference and up pops the memo it's referring to. And the memo will be, at the top it will say top secret. And here it is on your screen. Some of them heavily redacted, but nevertheless, you have the materials on which the Chilcot Report are based right in front of you. But in the Chilcot Report are several memoranda which show that what the British were trying to do after 9/11 was think of constructive ways to move the world forward, use 9/11 as leverage, get the Bush administration onside a game plan which would address simmering conflicts throughout the world, eliminate some of the causes of conflict, terrorism, domestic insurgency in a number of ways, put a new spin on international relations using this enhanced moral authority which the United States had in the immediate days after the 9/11 attacks. These were pretty innovative thoughts at the time, but they essentially went nowhere. Why did they go nowhere? Well, a major error was the U.S. handling of the Afghan situation, because it put the U.S. front and center in an Afghan quagmire about which it had already been warned. So lest one come forward and say, well, the United States didn't know what might happen. No, they knew what happened. Memoranda were drafted pointing out what was going to happen. There's an important article in the journal Foreign Affairs Magazine, which is the probably most authoritative U.S. Academic magazine on international relations, which pretty well points out what would happen if the United States went into Afghanistan in the wrong way. Its decisions, the American government's decisions on interrogation by duress and torture, then divided its own agencies, and they divided the Allies. At little or no gain for the United States, but with contentious claims years after the fact about the effectiveness of these measures. And then, of course, within 2 years, you have the Iraq War, which was a disastrous conflict whose reverberations we still feel today. And I recognize there's enormous scope here for discussion, but my view was that the war on terror was essentially self-defeating. It had moments of tactical success. It did eliminate much of the Al-Qaeda senior leadership, but it also played into the Al-Qaeda narrative of being persecuted, of being attacked. So new movements, new people soon arose to replace the dead, the imprisoned, the vanquished. And they made other countries the focus of their terrorist activities. And those activities seem to us now even more challenging today than they were probably in the post-9/11 period. Eventually, one by one, case by case in the Canadian courts, as well as in Britain, Germany, Australia, Sweden, Italy, the war on terror was on trial. Although ironically, it was not on trial in the country of its origin because of the American legal system. So what went wrong for Canada's role in detentions, renditions, and the war on terror? This is a slightly different question. I've used 5 case studies in the book. Ahmed El-Mati, Abdul Al-Malki, Maher Arar, Abdullah Qadir, and Abu Sufyan Abdul Razik. Of the case studies, 4 of them have pretty well been resolved. The Abdul Razik case is still before the Canadian courts. There are other lawsuits still in the courts. We haven't heard the last of this. They're instructive, and there's a lot of information on each court case out there. Canada's 2 major Canadian agencies, CSIS and the RCMP, had lots of terrorist or potential terrorist targets in sight prior to 9/11 inside Canada. And it was perfectly appropriate for them to launch investigations and do what they were mandated by law to do about these potential threats. But there were lots of problems, a little bit before 9/11, but mostly after 9/11. The investigations that they launched on many Canadians were either inadequate or non-existent. And conclusions reached in some of the cases were careless, wrong, or inflammatory. And I use those words, careless, wrong, or inflammatory, because they come from the 2 public inquiries which were held and which examined the cases exhaustively against what was done by CSIS and the RCMP. But possibly worse than that, erroneous information was then passed to the United States, essentially the FBI and the CIA, with serious consequences for many individuals. And those individuals who had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda and nothing whatsoever to do with the terrorist threat. They ended up detained, they ended up interrogated, they ended up mistreated abroad at the hands of foreign captors. Now, all of this was compounded by problems of cooperation here in Ottawa among Canadian agencies in working together at a time of fear, overload, overwork, confusion, particularly among the 4 Canadian players on these cases, the RCMP, CSIS, Foreign Affairs Canada, and the Privy Council Office. The five cases in the book are pretty detailed and complicated. We can go into some of them if you have questions today, but they give a sense of the disorder of the times and the absence of clear policy lines on a number of fundamental questions at a time when calming the water should have been a major policy goal. Settlements were reached on the Meher case in 2007 by the Harper government. The terms of that settlement were replicated in the Omar Khadr settlement 10 years later. There was a strong public reaction to that settlement, and that gives you some sense of the difficulty of these cases. When there are accusations of wrongdoing, when there are court cases that go against the government, but there are difficulties in weighing exactly how the Canadian government should respond. Each case is also nuanced and somewhat unique. I've tried to draw a few public policy conclusions from these episodes and from Canadian involvement in the war on terror. And let me cite 3 of them today, more to kick the ball off for possible discussion. The first is that Canada confronts the inevitable dilemma in the security intelligence area of its dealings with the United States. And some would argue, and we certainly have seen this repeatedly argued over the years, we should distance ourselves more from the United States, especially when, as like in the war on terror, the United States goes completely off the rails. And my argument is that the idea of distance is tactically possible on a number of issues here and there, but it's not practical as a strategic reality because we share the same continent as the United States. We are driven towards cooperation. Or as one commentator put it years ago, Canada and the United States are best friends whether we like it or not. We can't duplicate the U.S. intelligence system, so that idea, forget that idea from the outset. What we might be doing, and what we possibly should be doing, is using our record of cooperation, which is pretty good, with the United States, to help define the latitude we might have, the scope we might enjoy for disagreement when that occurs, and make that disagreement more tangible and slightly clearer than it was in the past. My second conclusion is about terrorism itself. I'm getting behind myself. Fighting terrorism is not a war, and terrorism is not an existential threat. Certainly it's not an existential threat to Canada or the United States, despite its human and material costs. It has to be fought with law enforcement, supported by good intelligence, in conjunction with diaspora communities. There's no other way to do it. And in a country like Canada, that involves agencies cooperating with communities in an atmosphere of trust and confidence. I've heard that there has been progress over the past decade, but this is long-term work, and that progress is the type of thing that I would like to see certainly discussed in a balanced fashion in a parliamentary committee. The third observation was perhaps the most difficult one I found to write about in this book because I really didn't know how to phrase it, and I still don't know how to phrase it. Let me try. We need more deliberate, mature public discussion about security and intelligence issues in Canada. What we have now is a dialogue of the deaf. We have certain advocates on one side, we have certain advocates on another side, and there is no scope for narrowing differences or meeting views, and there's very little public discussion that tries to weigh the relevance and the balance of one view as opposed to another. This is handled much better in the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, and it's perhaps because they have more solidly based think tanks, or they have practitioners who are out there capable of moderating debates on some of these issues. But this is the type of idea I'd like to see on the agenda of the new Parliamentary Committee on Security and Intelligence, which has been launched by the Trudeau government. And it should also feature in debates in the university environment. And perhaps this is something that the University of Ottawa and Carleton University could take over in their security and intelligence studies. And of course, underpinning all of this is better accountability regimes which have the respect of Canadians and the cooperation of the agencies. Just one last point before we open it up. There will be various points of view on the case studies that I've written about, or some of the other views I've offered in the book, and I respect that. But there's one position that's completely untenable, and let me outline that position right now. It's the idea that if we had the opportunity for a do-over, we'd do exactly the same things today as we did after 9/11. That is simply not tenable. Canadians have to be confident that we've looked at the record, issues have been addressed. They may be issues that are so sensitive that they can't be addressed publicly. They may be issues that have to deal with relationships among agencies that are inherently secretive. That may be the way it has to work, but we have to have some confidence that it's been done. We have to be certain that we're better equipped today in dealing with terrorism than we were in the aftermath of 9/11. And that confidence is crucial in avoiding a repetition of the type of errors that occurred in a war on terror that went seriously wrong. Okay, thanks a lot. Sorry I mishandled some of the page numbers of the slides.
Okay, I will. I can tell that you're bursting with questions, and so I will collect comments and collect who is up first. Go ahead.
A generic question, Dan, about the trade-off between accountability and security, and there's a similar debate about accountability and privacy, and often the trade-off is said to be between security and privacy. Would you end up with a better dynamic if you could look at it as a security accountability trade-off, with trust being your bottom line outcome?
Yeah.
And it's a simplistic comment that comes from other discussions.
Yeah.
It seems to me that getting an appreciation of that discussion makes accountability easier.
Yeah.
And when you look at the debate in
Yeah.
the scans, Northern Europe, they seem to have gone a lot farther down that road,
Yeah.
partly because they have to.
Yeah. Well, I don't look at the trade-off between accountability and security. But I think there can be accountability in the security agencies without any compromise to security at all. There doesn't have to be. What I'm conscious of what the heads of the agencies tell us, and I'm respectful of that. Accountability is enormously costly. It's costly in terms of staff time. It's costly in terms of the types of organization you have to build for accountability. But so be it. So be it. If we have the agencies, then we have to have the accountability, and out of that comes the trust that supports the work of the agencies. And they can't. In other words, I think it's wrong for an agency head to argue against accountability, because accountability should be the best friend of the agency head. Should be. But how to get that done in a system which is less draining for the agencies and more transparent? I don't know how to do it. Eric.
Yeah.
You friend?
Eric?
You're a friend.
Yes.
Yep.
You mentioned at one point that the system didn't work because there was no leadership from the top, that the Privy Council, the security advisor there, did not do a role of bringing people together and coordinating a common approach among agencies. I'd like to push that one level higher. Can you give a lecture privately to the present Prime Minister or his successor? Because isn't it true that our Prime Ministers have wanted to avoid the unseemly questions they had to face if they faced security intelligence and studied it closely, and that the Prime Minister of the day needs to insist that he is a really good security advisor and the Privy Council does the job of coordination that is needed. Perhaps the parliamentary committee would drive him in that direction, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, some of the problems, to be fair to the National Security Advisor at the time, some of the problems took place before that position was created in about 2004.
But there were guys before that who did the same thing.
There were people that were supposed to have done the same job, but they didn't have quite the same authority built into the picture. But also there was, and this is more recollection than something that's in the book, but there was a public service maxim that was used, which was basically, this is the work of the agencies, let them do it. Let them do it. In other words, coordination is not always necessary.
Keep our hands clean.
But on a lot of these cases, it was quite evident that things were falling apart. Coordination should have been done. It was true that the Prime Minister and senior ministers had a tradition of not getting involved in cases. They didn't want to be briefed on cases, and it was certainly a tradition of the RCMP not to brief ministers on cases, because it then involved the ministers in something that might compromise the course of justice, or so the argument goes. So they kept away. When the Prime Minister asked for briefings, they didn't get much. Some ministers also deliberately did not want briefings because they didn't want to be involved in the issues. The issues were too murky, they were too complicated, all the decisions that you could make were bad. There were no good alternatives, and there was no political upside to these cases. So it seems to me that you need some recognition that there may not be a political upside to some of these issues, but somebody has to be in charge, and it's basically the Prime Minister's job. And it's supported by a couple of relevant ministers, the Minister of Public Safety particularly. And I'm not sure that's in place. I don't know how the system now works.
Wesley's next.
Wesley Borg, Dan, I look forward to reading your book. Two quick questions for you. The claim of Canadian innocence about American policy in the war on terror post 9/11. Let me push back on that. Really by asking, what do you mean by fully briefed by the U.S.? That none of U.S. allies were fully briefed. What does that mean exactly? And secondly, the implication of that suggests that Canadian officials had to wait to be fully briefed to understand sufficiently. And I've always been struck by Jack Hooper's testimony before the Arar Commission, which indicates to me that CSIS was pretty aware of U.S. extraordinary rendition plans at the time of the handling of the Arar case. It also indicates that the RCMP were not, but CSIS seems to have been, and how widely this knowledge was spread throughout the Canadian government, I don't know. But I'm a bit puzzled by that statement. It doesn't sit well with me, and I'd be interested in further comments on it. The second question, I suppose, is I'm just curious as to why you decided to treat the Abdullah Khader case as opposed to one that you know extremely well and readers might want to hear from you, which is the Omar case.
Yeah. Okay. We'll take the last one first. Basically because of the Khader cases, and there are lots of them, because almost every Khader seems to have elicited a case of some description. I thought the Abdullah Khader case was interesting, and it was the one case that hadn't been put into the public record very much. Now, this is the oldest son of Ahmed Saeed Khader, who was tracked down and captured by the Pakistani intelligence service in Islamabad, and then came back, was brought back by the Canadian government to Toronto, and he was involved in an extradition proceeding initiated by the United States, which failed after 4 years. So he was but the whole saga I found quite interesting. The chapter enabled me to write a bit about the other Catters, but I didn't think that I would add much to what's been written already about Omar Khatter, which is quite extensive, and there's a good documentary about his life too. So that was the main reason. There was, on the first question, I knew that when I wrote that sentence that nobody was, I knew it was going to elicit opposition, and I knew that people would disagree with it. But let me try to disaggregate what I meant by that, because I think I do it better in the book over a whole bunch of pages. But certainly, all of the agency heads in Canada knew what American intentions were, because they were told by George Tenet, the head of the CIA, "The shackles, my friends, have come off," and that's what he told them. And he told me he was going to work with Syria and Russia. So, but that's about it. He didn't go into detail on exactly how the relationships would work or what he was going to do. And different allies found out at different times exactly what was going on. Now, I don't think any Canadian agency knew anything about the black sites. The Brits at one point discovered the black sites, because the Brits incidentally, although not with their knowledge apparently, helped the United States in a couple of black site operations. But they should have known, whereas there was no reason for the Canadian agencies to have known about the black sites. And they eventually, the knowledge of the black sites came out in a Washington Post article to the public domain. I think probably that was the first time the State Department found out about it. It was probably the first time the CSIS found out about it too. Now on rendition, no, the rendition is one where that's the one that was picked up by CSIS because of the Maher-Arar case, and it was one that, and not only because of Maher-Arar, because by the time Maher-Arar was picked up, 2 other Canadians were also behind bars. Abdullah al-Malki was already in the same prison that Maher-Arar would arrive at, and Ahmed al-Mahdi had been in that prison and was at that time in prison in Egypt. So there was a pattern there that CSIS examined, and there was the famous quote, I think it was in fact a Jack Hooper quote that was quoted in the O'Connor Commission report, and I use it in the book. Basically, here's what we think, that the Americans want to get Arar to Jordan where they can have their way with them, I think is the way he put it. Yeah, that's what was known at the time, but by fully briefed, I meant here's what the system looks like. You tell us who you want off the streets, and we get them off the streets for you. And that's basically what happened to the Swedes. The Swedish Security Service asked the Americans to get rid of two Swedish immigrants, and the CIA did it for them. So there was a general knowledge as months and years went by of things happening, but I don't see any record of anyone briefing the Canadians or the Brits fully on plans. And in fact, basically they were lied to. When the Brits approached Condoleezza Rice and asked for explanations on a couple of things, she basically said, detention policies are humane. There's no problem with human rights, which of course was a complete lie, and she knew it at the time. So that's what I mean by fully briefed. It wasn't that we didn't have suspicions and we didn't have some evidence.
Do you want to respond, Wesley?
No, that's
You
great.
have a look of skepticism.
He always looks skeptical.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your interesting presentation. I have two questions. One's a really quick one. In your list, I guess it was on slide 9, I think I had several Canadian agencies.
Yep.
I noticed that CSE wasn't on there. Is there a reason why CSE wasn't part of that list?
Yep.
That's the first question. My second question is more broadly defined in terms of what you were talking about. Lots of cooperation and maybe not cooperation by the agencies on the fighting the war. How much cooperation today do you see with respect to the leadership of various terrorist groups around the world? Are they, in fact, individual cells that are operating in their local geography, or is there actually some coordination?
Yeah. Well, on the first one, I didn't see that CSE, we're talking here about problems of cooperation, I didn't see CSE as part of the problem. CSE has material that is used by CSIS, it's used by the RCMP, it's used by Foreign Affairs, but it wasn't part of the coordination problem. Now, they need an accountability framework, they have one. Whether it's effective or not, I don't know, but I didn't see any evidence that CSE was part of the 9/11 problem. Now, on current terrorism, I really don't know. I don't know enough about what's happening among terrorist groups to make a judgment about to what extent they cooperate. It's what generally has happened in the past is that terrorist groups move around. They change their names quickly. They change their allegiances fairly quickly, and it's not hard to find a geographic base. So we face the problem of trying to track down people that live under different names and different titles all the time. My argument would be if we'd handled this a bit better after 9/11, we probably wouldn't be confronting the same tractable problems today.
Okay, so just so we're clear, this is friend in mostly wearing black, the friend mostly wearing blue, and then the friend wearing yellow. Friends is how my kids call them. They call their students in their class in kindergarten. Everybody's a friend. Nice, yeah. So,
I'm just wondering whether you cite the cases and you say that it's just one that is not quite resolved. We don't have any cases that are on the boil now, or that we know of. Is it possible that our agencies have learned something from the way in which those cases were resolved, that part of the problem has gone away?
I don't. It's hard to say. If you saw I think it was the Globe this morning, Ralph Goodale making some comments about us not coming to the assistance of Canadians who have been captured by the Kurds in I think it's Iraq, and it seemed to be
Syria.
Syria. He seemed to be speaking on behalf of the Minister of Foreign Affairs on consular issues. Although I'm not sure exactly where this policy came from, that we would not offer consular assistance to Canadians captured in certain areas.
May have been reversed.
Yeah. Already?
Yeah, may have been.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, it struck me as a bizarre article, bizarre quotations by Ralph Goodale, who's usually a pretty solid guy on security issues. But it
Victor,
indicates,
what did Victor say?
It may have been reversed this morning. There was an article saying that Foreign Affairs had...
A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian?
Yeah. Well, but some of them, and this was a problem that we encountered in the initial reaction after 9/11. I think of the 5 Canadian cases, all of them are dual nationals of one country or another. To what extent do we do whatever? And so we had ministers wavering on, yeah, he's not really a Canadian, he's something else. Well, no, and the decision was eventually, no, if you're a Canadian, you get consular service. If you have a second nationality, that may be a problem in your management of the case, but it's not an issue of principle. So I don't think we have any more cases on the go, but you never know. Somebody may come back to Canada, make an allegation, and there is a case on the go.
Hi. I think Abdullah Aziz is still under trial, right?
Abdullah?
Abdullah Aziz. The Abdullah Aziz that's not my question, but in the man in Sudan, isn't that trial still going on?
Abdul Razik, yeah.
And that's not resolved?
No, it's not resolved.
I think you said that there was no links with Al-Qaeda or terrorism, and I assume you were talking about the 5 individuals that you highlight. But if that's the case, it means that Canadian authorities were pursuing completely innocent individuals. And that, I think, is something that probably should be looked at if that's the case.
Yeah.
And that is the case in your view.
Yeah, it is the case. But one of the problems of analysis that everybody had, and the Canadian agencies weren't alone in this, after 9/11, if you looked at somebody and you found out that person had gone to Afghanistan, right away they jumped the queue right to the top as far as suspicion of association with terrorism went. Some of them attended training camps. And again, that puts you a step higher. But what was lost was that the training camps were not Al-Qaeda training camps. Their goals were completely different than joining terrorist organization. Again, these are things that were lost over time, and other countries made the same errors of analysis based on fragmentary information. One or two of them knew bin Laden or had met bin Laden, and that's also a bad thing. So, and to admit it is worse. So they had problems. They had problems there. It was not a very good record of investigation. That's for sure.
I don't want to pursue this, but that means, I guess, the definition of innocence. If they went before 9/11 to training camps, it's the Charlie Wilson's War, I guess that's okay. But if they went after 9/11 to training camps in Afghanistan, if they knew bin Laden,
Yeah.
does that not indicate some sort of, I don't know, a lack of innocence, I suppose?
Oh yeah, sure. Oh yeah. Well, of this group, all except Abdullah Qadir is an exception because he grew up essentially
In the
with bin Laden.
Yes.
For a couple of years, not for very long, but he knew bin Laden and when he was a kid. But the others, their associations with Afghanistan were all prior to 9/11. And there were no associations with bin Laden or Al Qaeda. So Abdullah Qadir was an exception to that. There is somebody in the book, Mansur Jabara, who did pledge loyalty to pledge bayat to bin Laden and worked for bin Laden. So yeah, there's no innocence there, absolutely none. So what do you do about that case? But he's not one of the 5 case studies.
But Maher Arar signed a lease, or went on a lease for a friend, and then met somebody outside a restaurant in the market in the rain and had a conversation. Seemed to be the basis of
Yeah.
the RCMP's conclusions.
Well, because the person he was having lunch with was the #1 target in Ottawa, which was also a misplaced analysis. But that's you end up with guilt by association in a lot of cases.
Okay, lots of questions. Friend in yellow is next. You're after.
If you had any further thoughts on, the transition from sort of illegal rendition to what you discussed, either non-rendition or non-assistance to Canadian citizens. The argument is often made that you can't prosecute these people effectively if they're brought back. So in Britain, I think it's much more active than in Canada. There's a movement afoot to deprive them of British citizenship and leave the wives of ISIS operatives, British, stranded, which is also, illegal under international law by rendering people stateless.
Yeah.
So, and the debate is going on in
Yeah.
Canada to some extent. So do you have any further thoughts on that issue?
No, I don't. There are probably a fair number of Canadians who have come back from conflicts abroad who one would think could be prosecuted. The trouble is, it's almost impossible to get a prosecution going because of the evidence required. And certainly, from the RCMP perspective, and the Department of Justice, it's horrendously costly. So they don't want to touch it with a barge pole. But the issue of citizenship, though, is loaded with problems. That's just a dog's breakfast.
Thank you. My name is Salim from Pakistan High Commission.
Yeah.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm a career diplomat, and I was in Berlin when 9/11 happened in Pakistan Embassy. So I have a question regarding Pakistan. We are engaged with U.S. thanks to the situation in Afghanistan since 1979.
Yeah.
And once in 1988, the Soviets withdrew Timor River.
Yeah.
In 89, Pakistan was sanctioned.
Yeah.
Similarly, after 9/11, when we were again the frontline state and Pakistan was declared a non-NATO ally, and in October 2001, the operations practically started in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, by March 2003, within 17 months, the whole focus, NATO, US, they went for Iraq.
Yeah.
So I don't think any country can be rehabilitated, reconstructed in 17 months. Although Taliban are removed from Kandahar and Kabul.
Yeah.
So the question is, you are also a close, very close ally and neighbor of US. There was situation which have affected Canada-Pakistan relations as well. After 9/11, I think your global affairs, they had a program how to stop terrorism coming in from Afghanistan or Pakistan to Canada. And that policy is still prevalent. You have to realize Pakistan being the immediate neighbor, even today all the refugees from Afghanistan, if they have to travel back, they have to go to Afghanistan through Pakistan. Most of the flight routes are via UAE, Pakistan and onwards to Afghanistan. The problem is travel advisory, bad publicity. 1st of January 2018, first tweet of US President against Pakistan.
Yeah.
2 weeks back there was a message from Secretary of Defense
Yeah.
that Pakistan has to do more. So we have done enough, but no, we say that no more. It is the allies who have to do more in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
The situation now is US is directly negotiating with Taliban in Qatar. As you said, the US did not share plans with the 5 PIs. So did they not share plans with us?
Yeah.
No exit strategy in 1988 and after 9/11 as well. So would you please suggest some recommendations to Pakistan government? Being with your experience being a NATO friend and US ally and neighbor, and also some suggestions from global affairs.
Yeah.
Even today, our education, our students' visa acceptance rate has gone down. Even now, under Liberal government, our diaspora immigrant applications are mostly rejected. No Canadian businessman can travel to Pakistan. No Pakistani businessman can travel to Canada because travel advisory and the other thing is bad publicity. I would appreciate your recommendation. Thank you.
Well, good luck. Good luck. That's my word. Well, my view, and this we have with Eileen Alexiak here, with the Afghan expert. I'm hesitant to offer any views on Afghanistan, but there's a good book that came out last year by Steve Call called Directorate S on the Pakistani ISI.
Yeah.
The intelligence service, which is first class, and it's got a lot of material in it. But my basic view was that where the Afghan war went wrong was within weeks of 9/11, when the United States decided that its allies of choice were the Northern Alliance. And why was that? Because who supported the Northern Alliance? India, which is not exactly Pakistan's best friend, Russia, and Iran. But the United States thought that, I think essentially, well, money buys anything. And if you throw enough money at the Northern Alliance, you can make a coalition that can govern Afghanistan. When Karzai took office, one of his prime goals was to reconcile the Taliban and to try to get the Taliban on board, which had just crumbled. And he had opportunities that were vetoed by the American government. And my view was that after that, the Allies got into the quagmire, and the quagmire wasn't just Afghanistan itself. The quagmire was Western allies involved in a civil war in Afghanistan against the Taliban and against Pakistan, because Pakistan helped create the Taliban, and Pakistan helped sustain the Taliban over time for very good strategic reasons which should have been appreciated. And had Karzai been allowed to do something about the situation, things might have evolved more favorably. But ever since then, Pakistani relations with the United States have gone off the rails, because Pakistani strategic interests haven't been taken into account, and the role of the Afghan government has become more and more complicated vis-a-vis Islamabad. But good luck, because it's not an easy uphill fight with this American administration.
Dan, the lack of cooperation runs throughout your book. Partly, I think, because of the different mandates of the different agencies.
Yeah.
Do you see any realistic way in which this can be made better?
Which cooperation?
Yeah.
You mean among Canadian agencies?
Among the different agencies,
Well,
the five principal ones.
But I think it all depends on Privy Council Office leadership at the time.
Yeah.
That's the key to it, because the agencies themselves have their own separate mandates, they have their own way of doing business, they have their own preferences and priorities. And one of the problems of the cooperation was that, and each agency would come to the table and basically say, well, this is our priority and we're going to do it. And some other agency would say, yeah, but that clashes with our priority, which is different, and we want to do this. Well, who resolves those differences among agencies except the Privy Council Office? That's to me, the only sane solution.
But given that the mechanics exist in PCO, is it personalities or is it political obfuscation that is at the root of the direction that has been historic?
Well, for years and years, one of the key problems was the position of the National Security Advisor,
Yeah.
which was not well respected around Ottawa, and only intermittently had a role in asking agencies to cooperate. Well, now that position seems to have evolved over time to where that position could play a decisive role in effecting cooperation, even among agencies that don't want to cooperate, even forcing them to the table. So I think that's the right approach, to have a person powerful enough to be able to say, you have to cooperate. There is no choice. You're not going it alone on such and such an issue. But barring that, I don't see any other way.
Dan, I'd like to come back to accountability in a way. There have been a number of screw-ups. I haven't read your book, but I did spend quite a bit of time at the O'Connor inquiry, etc. And there have been both sins of commission and sins of omission, if you like, within our role in many of these. Has there been any penalties paid, or has anybody been fired or whatever? The head of the AO Canada project at the time of Harar was promoted to Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP.
Yeah.
But has there been any evidence on the other side that somebody within the system has paid some sort of a price for the screw-up?
Yeah. I'm not aware of any consequence for any of the screw-ups. I'm not aware, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. I have suspicions of one case where there might have been some consequences, but But the accountability machine is not built to establish individual accountability like that. And it's not something I think that you would encounter in any department. You wouldn't even think of that as a possible consequence, which is a serious problem. Now I think part of the problem of accountability, well, there was an RCMP accountability system which didn't work for various reasons. I didn't think very highly of the CERC of the time for other reasons. And in the book I criticize a couple of its reports, the conclusions in its reports. But at the same time, the CERC members were complaining about their mandate to the government. They were saying, we can't do the job because our mandate doesn't make any sense. We need a different mandate to enable us to investigate cases more thoroughly. And the government wasn't responding. Well, now recently, I don't know how far along the road we are to new machinery, but recently the idea was taken up that we go back to the O'Connor recommendations and that we do a better job and get a system that incorporates all of the agencies under some kind of accountability framework that makes sense.
Okay. I think we're going to make these the last two questions.
Thanks very much. Good to see you again. You've talked a lot about the things
Could you
that have
speak
gone
up,
wrong.
please?
Thanks again for an excellent presentation. Surprise. And much of your discussion has been on errors of the past and things that should have been done better. I keep thinking of the way forward because terrorism is not going away. Islam is not changing particularly, probably never will. So what are the lessons that you drew that tell us about how we should better conduct ourselves in the future to address this global problem?
Yeah. Well, I think that my own view, as I said at the outset, was that terrorism was on the wane in the late 1990s. Extremism is not a natural outgrowth of Islam. So we don't have to say, well, there'll always be extremist and terrorist movements out there with us. No, they don't have to be there. Most of them are fed not by Islam, they're fed by underdevelopment or authoritarian regimes or some local problems. They're local insurgencies in which Islamic extremism has become a part of that insurgency. So that has to be addressed. Now, is it? And I quote a report from 25 years ago that a member of the audience here drafted in the Department of Foreign Affairs on that. You have to tackle some of those problems. You can't think of tackling terrorism as one problem separate from the bigger problems that give rise to those terrorist movements. And the fact that they joined together was a phenomenon of the 1990s. Well, they have to be disaggregated by tackling problems in a fairly systematic way. But sadly, we appear to have gone away from that in the last couple of years towards tackling global problems. We have to get back to it. Now, there's another problem, which is for us a problem, but I think it's more serious for Britain and it's more serious for France, and that is domestic radicalization, which is a completely different problem. And I think that tackling that phenomenon demands community involvement in Canada and cooperation on the part of police agencies and security agencies, but most of all, the diaspora groups. And it's fostered through the internet. It's fostered through associations with groups online. I'm not sure exactly how that can be counteracted.
Okay, Paul, you have a good one.
Thanks, Dan. So I mean, these aren't the only cases which are going on. There's other issues like detainees in Afghanistan, which to me suggests there's something deeper going on, because what you have listed here, like inadequate investigations, careless conclusions, inflammatory language, lack of concern for consequences, that's not actually what went wrong. That's a symptom of something deeper which has gone wrong, which is causing that, because this sort of behavior doesn't just happen. There's something deeper causing it. So what is your analysis of what deeper problem.
Deeper problem of which one?
Well, like I mean, what caused people to behave in a sloppy, hasty, ignorant way? I mean, like things like detainees in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
It was obvious that this was illegal practice.
Yeah.
Okay, but people just didn't care, or they didn't know, or they were ignorant, or they just rushed into it. Something was going on at a deeper level, which is causing these things, right? So what is your view?
Well, there are lots of things going on. On the part of the Americans, I think the search for vengeance, retribution, overwhelmed any common sense. And you see that most clearly in a very small, a select episode of about 700 detainees in the New York City area that were captured immediately after 9/11. None of whom had anything to do with terrorism. They were immigrants, or they were illegal immigrants, or people without visas, proper visas, jailed in American jails. And basically, at the time, the prison guards were basically let wild. You could, and these were Americans who felt, these are the guys that killed 3,000 of our citizens. So we're not going to show them much kindness. Thank you. So that kind of raw emotion was part of the reaction. Military reaction in Afghanistan, very, very interesting. I think it's on the part of the Canadian military, and I go into this in a couple of pages, but not very much because it's not central to the book, but one of it was frustration that Canada had a very small number of troops on the ground in Afghanistan. There was a ceiling on the number of troops allowed to go to Afghanistan, which put pressure on those that were there. And the last thing they wanted to deal with were detainees. So if you could slough this problem off on somebody else, the Afghan national service, you did that. Or if you give them to Americans, you would. But you didn't want to deal seriously with this problem because it was too time-consuming and consumed too many troops to warrant the problem. The trouble with I think with the RCMP in particular was the two groups that were created by the RCMP to deal with some of these cases. Certainly, 3 of the cases that are in the book, they had zero training. They came from, I don't know where, a drug squad in Vancouver or municipal policing in Manitoba. I don't know where they came from, but they were brought together with absolutely not 1 ounce of consideration of training or background on the issues. And so you say, well, they were careless with words. They jumped to conclusions. Well, of course they did, because they're told, look, you guys are going to prevent a 9/11 in Canada. You're responsible for that. And by the way, you don't have any training. And get busy. Well, what is? To me, it's a massive vote of lack of confidence in the management of the force at the time to allow this to happen. And I'm surprised that the O'Connor Commission report let them off as soft as it did on this point. CSIS was in better shape at the time because they had long been following terrorism, but the RCMP wasn't in good shape at all.
All right, please join me in thanking Dan for answering your questions. And for writing the book as well. That would be and we'll be happy to take more of your critical questions.
Or uncritical ones too.
I'm surprised more people didn't ask questions. There's only a select few who kept typing up.
Poor is old
You probably get arrested. It was called
dressed. By the time I like got the jacket on, I was like half
I was asked to do that. No, before I went to it was after I did the Hi, good to see you. Keeping well? Yeah, keeping very well. Good. Married to good to see you. Yeah, I want to Venice. Are you doing anything? No. Smart move.
I'll soon be 86, so...
That's a good time to start. There's lots of time to go.
Actually, Michael Caine was interviewed this morning.
Yes,
CBC.
he was great.
He's 85 as well, and he's still churning them out.
Yeah. It must be difficult though. I mean, I'm trying to use my short-term memory. How the hell does an actor remember the dialogue?
Are you going on Saturday to the bazaar?
Which bazaar? No, I have no contact with it. Even though I have a book coming out after Christmas. First World War, British Canadian heroes. Only Canadian officers throughout World War I that escaped. Then he went to Russia and fought the Russian War.
Was it Hanson?
No, Anderson is his name. They all have the same, half the best names. I ran into your daughter about 1 or 2 years ago when she was up at Kings. I don't know if she's still there.
Yeah. Just finished your third year.
It was nice time to get this to Take care, guys.
As a friend of Gottlieb taught the person who wrote that thing about you know, it was very sophisticated hair, very sophisticated trouble.
Maybe anytime. Maybe anytime.
That's logic, right?
Yeah, it's not the
That's why
street, and I was there not long ago. He would often just turn over the menu. Right. I thought it was hilarious. Yeah, that's the world we live in. Thank you very much. Okay, great. Okay. Yeah. Sign it? Well, Graham, originally was chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee just for a while. Maybe a lot of people sort of laughed at Bill and sort of basically thought he was a
privileged son of Rosetown.
Yeah,
but there was more gravity.
And it was really, and what I did and what I concluded at the end of that review, and LRC you can do really well. Oh no, I'm not doing this. Okay, anyway, so all right. Okay, good. See you then. See you. Come on, my hands were
we would have been better informed on these important issues. Because the thing is, the bill is one of those,
Economically means that we should work for other allies.
in an earlier era, same rights. But what we don't know, if you did your homework, and you asked reasonable international relations, and it was knowledgeable, it wasn't just, you know, out of the television before we're asking questions for. Well, yeah, either, or to get the money. Don't that he had an obligation. You were entitled to an answer. Even if it didn't look bad. You didn't say anything. And then this was all around, you know, all the fights with Alberta and all of that on the National Energy Program. I mean, it was pretty dicey. I guess we were getting kicked out there.
But they were better.
So only be at one end of the
I think so. We're 8.
maybe there.
You want to? That's actually a good idea.
Afghanistan, where we thought, so this is our
Okay, so there's water here. In the thing. No, I don't think it's for that. I think it's maybe the house or something. What, do you think it's from the roof?
Oh, yeah.
You're right. Monica? You wanna go there where there's less distance?
But I'm listed on the website.
Okay.
If you Google me on the university,
you'll
find it. Okay, much appreciated.
Okay.
So be careful with that, there's water that. Wait, be careful. I got it.
It's a different model.
Doesn't mean you don't have deliverables, but it's grants, so.
Yeah.
More flexibility to like, I said, I don't know what Transport Canada has, but you will probably be open to working either.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, when.
Okay,
when we
it's good of you to come in.
Okay.
Okay.
That's the only
You
one.
said leave here.
CNSC, same thing. But because they're not the sole, it's comfortable. And we line up timelines with
As long as they're comfortable with the language.
Yeah.
And you're below what are typically considered sole source
Yep.
limits for directed contracts with their competition.
Yeah.
For the university.
Makes sense.
I wish them luck.
No, and we'll sort of see where it is. Oh, this one is this is the least.
Yeah, that's the one that was broken, right? Yeah.
That's the fun chair, okay.
Oh, yeah, I do. I'm not going, but Antoinette's going and she knows it well. Yeah, that's a great place. I think it was.
Is that one better?
Yeah, it is. I'm gonna remember, we'll have to mark that chair and sometimes we have a meeting when we want to, you know.
I'm gonna write Lisa on the
Exactly,
foot.
that's for Lisa.
Good. Well, thanks a lot.
Oh, that's great, thanks.
So then the juice is here, the glasses are here.
Awesome.
Cool.
Do you know that this imagining Canada's future? Like, where is this? Oh, maybe somebody will know where this is at.
I found this. I mean, this is on, this is on Shirk's website. These are paid.
I can help you with anything in your
website.
Okay, I'm good though.
But do
Okay.
they,
Let me just get
so
the,
it's 2018.
yeah. So what they had is they.
Usually they come later and they pick everything up.
2014, and today they had a number of objectives.
The tripod is yours as well, right?
No, yep, that was here.
That was here? Oh, wow.
Where'd it go?
People are.
Yeah, it was here.
There's 6 objectives, which are at the
Wow,
bottom
people are
of
forgetting stuff.
Yeah.
Six future challenges.
Yeah, that's
at the
kind of
bottom of the first
Yep,
page.
yep,
And you're looking at number 5,
yep.
though arguably, I think it's probably the one that's most relevant, and I think it's not a stretch to say that's Innovation 21.
Yeah, I would agree.
And then, but the message appears to be that researchers, when you're making funding requests to PERC, pay attention to these 6 areas, and the extent to which you make linkages to those 6 areas, you're more likely to succeed. But it doesn't appear to be any. See if you look at funding opportunities in the top right here.
Yeah.
I've got a different printout.
Okay, yeah.
That's the issue here.
Yeah.
SSHRC invites all applicants to review Imagining Canada's future 6 future challenge areas and subset questions,
Yeah.
and to consider addressing one or more of these areas
okay.
in their research proposal. Now, there doesn't appear to be any new research funding.
There was though, initially there was, because I remember it was easy math, basically literature reviews. I went to a session where on the natural resources where they had people who had gotten the money come together. That's why I was asking where it's at now.
Yeah,
Because there was money, but it was small money, $20,000.
Where was this?
Yeah, so
Was
that may
it
be
there?
here, and I guess it all.
Well,
So
I
this
think it
may be
was,
something
there was a lot of
where
congestion.
direct contact
Oh,
by your
okay.
folks
Oh,
with SSHRC
maybe I'll
this
leave
side,
it
yeah,
would
here.
be worthwhile, or if you have other
Yeah.
colleagues. And the interesting thing is subsets of the
I don't think it was this group, wait, I think.
subquestions.
It was
on
before,
6,
okay.
I printed up a page on how can emerging technologies be leveraged to benefit Canadians.
Yeah, I got
And,
that, yeah.
you know, why does society need to understand the risk opportunities related to ethical questions raised by the
Right.
adoption and version of disruptive technologies? Yeah.
Yeah.
And government balance competing needs of security and privacy. I mean, it's not, I'm not sure we would write these exactly if we were to say, give us some of the questions you're actually asking, but they're not far off.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I remember the NR